Hey guys, welcome back. Last week we created our first ability. This week we're going to fix some errors and make some improvements. Let's get started. In last week's video I had a slide that listed some future improvements. I've copied those here. So we need to apply the cold effect to enemies hit. Then we need to have the icicle projectile explode early if the first or second sphere trace hits. Remember there were 3 sphere traces in a row, and what was happening is that even if the first sphere trace hit, it still did the second and the third, and the projectile looked like it went through. It wasn't looking good, and we can definitely improve that with a little bit of replication. Then the other one was apply our movement velocity to the base projectile velocity so it looks right when we launch the icicle while running forward. So what's happening here is if we were running forwards, it kind of just seemed like the projectile never went away from us. We kind of caught up to it. We'll take a look at that one. And then the big one is that we were just using a temporary damage that was just applying 50 no matter what. It wasn't looking at our stats. It wasn't using any formulas. It didn't have crit damage. And so we're going to use our damage formula to calculate damage. Had to make a lot of changes to that to get that to work right. And we're going to go through those. So the first one was applying the cold effect to enemies hit. So let's go through this one and look what we had to do. So we're going to use a gameplay tag to define the statuses such as cold. So let's go take a look at that. Okay, so if we go into the project, we go to ability system, you'll see tags, and we have these 4 tags, and they are data tables, right? So when you go in here and you go to create a data table, I think it's under miscellaneous, you will see that it will pop up a type, and one of the types is gameplay tag table row. Right? So that's how these were created. And if we go into combat, I just like to, I mean, you could put them all in one table if you wanted, but I like to put them in different ones depending on category. So we've got ability tags, combat tags, but gameplay queue tags is kind of special because gameplay queues uses a kind of a special binding system. And then input tags is for enhanced input. But we're going to go into combat tags. And you will see here that we have ones called combat state. We have dead, wet, burning, cold, charged. I guess that's all we have. Oh, and iframe and dodged recently. Iframe means invulnerability frame. Anyway, so that's what we've got right now. The one that we're interested here is cold. But when you create these tables, they don't just instantly work. So what happens here is that we need to go into a file and tell the project about them. And so the way we do that is by going in here to this default gameplay tags INI. And so you'll see that we have a line here. These match the 4 tables, right? There's the combat tags, gameplay queue tags, the input tags, and the ability tags. So the only thing that's interesting here to kind of notice is that the content folder in UE is actually known as the game folder, right? So you can see content is game, and then there's the ability system, tags, and then you basically just duplicate the name with a dot in between. So it's combat tags dot combat tags, gameplay queue tags dot gameplay queue tags, right? Input tags dot input tags. And if you're wondering about that, you can actually just go copy the reference. You can come in here and you can say copy reference. And then if you put that in Notepad, you'll see that that's what the name is. And so that's how you can get that reference. Okay, the next thing that we have to look at here is having the icicle projectile explode early. So if you remember from last week, what would happen is that when we would shoot this projectile, if we were right up against our training dummy, the first sphere would hit, but then it would still do the second and then do the third and then show the damage, right? Because it was collecting all of them. And so it would wait till the end to show the damage. There was kind of a delayed damage. And then also it looked terrible because the projectile was going right through the enemy. And so it looked bad. And so what we need to do is we need to have a way to say, hey, if the first one of sphere trace hits, then stop. Don't continue processing. Stop, and then also explode the projectile, right? So it looks good, right? We're trying to make something that looks good. So what we had to do is we had to modify the wait multi-trace for targets. This is a custom task I wrote to have an option called be stop on first hit. Okay. And then what we had to do is we also had to modify it to return be stopped on first hit as true so that we know well, was that one that ended early, or is that one that just reached the end of, the three traces? And so let's take a look at what that looks like and how we use replication to make sure that this works on not just our owning client and the server, but also works good on proxy clients. So if we come into our abilities, I have renamed our ability to GA_Icicle. And so you'll notice that there's some new options here. On this wait multi-trace for targets, we added a new option called stop on first hit. Maybe some abilities we do want it to continue. We want it to go through the enemy and keep continuing to the end, and so we could uncheck this. But on this ability, we want to say, hey, if any trace hits, stop, don't run the rest of it, you're done. And then what'll happen is, if that's true, then this will be true. Stopped on first hit, right? So in this case, there's 3 trace steps that you can see here, right? There's 3 different trace steps. And so what happens is, if the first one hits or the second one hits, then this stopped on first hit will be true. But if it made it all the way to the third one and the third one was the one that hit, then this stopped on first trace will be false. And that allows us to have some branching logic here. And so what we do on this branching logic, and I put some print strings so that we can see this here, is I've said, hey, if it stopped on first hit, which means it stopped early, then we need to get the projectile, right, which we have from back here, our projectile actor. We got to cast it to our projectile, which is this BP_ice projectile, and we got to call explode. And so let's go to that ice projectile and take a look at what that looks like. So in our projectile, what I've done is I've created this custom event called explode. This is not a replicated event. This is just a normal event that's calling. This could be on the server. This could be on the owning client. It can't be on proxy clients. And I've created a variable here called trigger explode. And this is set to replicated rep notify. You can see the little replication icon, and it's rep notify, which means it created this on rep_trigger explode. And so this is starting as false. And then what's going to end up happening is it's going to get set to true, and it's going to trigger something on the proxy client. Now, I have set skip owner. So the reason I can do that is because the gameplay effect is also running on the owner. And so the owner will already have this explode happening prior to when it would get replicated back from the owner. So to save a little bit on replication, we're skipping the owner, and we are only replicating to the proxy clients, right? Because other proxy clients, the ability does not run, and they need to know that it exploded, so they don't see a projectile just go flying through an enemy without exploding. And so what we do is we go into that on rep trigger explode, and we say, okay, this is just in case for some reason it gets changed from true to false, that it won't trigger on that. It only will trigger when it changes from false to true. And then we've also got this other one here, has exploded, which you can see here is in this logic here. This might be duplicate. In the future, we'll have to see if that's potentially something duplicated, and we can just have one of those and don't need 2 of them. But for now, I'm checking that one too. And then setting has exploded if it did. So we got to stop the movement immediately. So this one, if you don't do this, it actually makes the projectile go a little bit past, right? So it looks pretty good, but it kind of goes a little bit to the other side of the test dummy and then explodes. If we do stop movement, it does it right away. It looks really good. And then basically this code here is the same exact code that's sitting right here, which happened at the end when it was done, right? After 0.3 seconds is when the projectile exploded on its own. But this basically says, hey, it was before 0.3, do it early. And so then we go here and we switch it and we run we show the explosion and we hide the projectile. These are the particle effects. And so by doing that, now it looks good because it hits them and explodes. Let's go take a look at what it looks like. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to fire it here. And if you look down there, you can see it says not stopped on first hit, not stopped on first hit. And so this is what it would do normally. It runs that 0.3 seconds and it explodes. Okay. But here is where in the previous version, I would fire it and it would go through and then explode as normal. Now you can see it's exploding right away. It's kind of right inside of it. It's as fast as it can trigger that trace and say, hey, we hit something. And you can see it plays the explode effect. And so this looks a whole lot better. Also, you'll notice that the damage number comes up quicker because it doesn't have to wait for the whole thing to finish. And you can see that now, if you look down at those logs, it says stopped on first hit, right? So that meant that it was true. That wait multi-trace for target was returning as true, which allowed us to call that explode, and everything looks good. Now let me try to see if we can run it with 2 clients here real quick and see what that looks like. We're going to change the number of players to 2. So what we're going to do here is we're going to have the one look at the other so that they can see what's happening. Okay. So if we see it continue to go through, then we'll know we have a problem with our proxy client. But you can see it goes away. It doesn't continue. It doesn't continue through. And so it's correctly calling that explode and stopping the projectile and making it explode early. So this is exactly what we wanted, and this is working. Okay, the next issue was applying our movement velocity to the base projectile velocity. So this one ended up actually being a bit too complicated. And the reason being is that it's going to be very difficult to dynamically sync up the projectile speed with the sequence of sphere traces. Okay, so what we did right now is we have 2 separate things running that are completely unrelated. We have a fake projectile that's just for looks, but doesn't do anything. And then we have a separate set of a sequence of timed sphere traces with fixed timings that kind of matches the speed of that. Well, the problem is if we take this variable running velocity and we add it to it, then what's going to end up happening is that the projectile that's fake is going to look better, but it's not going to match the traces. And so I was talking with my team about it, and one of them suggested, hey, you know what? It's probably just easier to speed up the projectile velocity so that even if you're running, it's faster than your run and goes away from you, and then it's probably fine. And so instead of modifying the projectile velocity by adding the velocity of the movement of the character, which would be technically correct for physics, we ended up just speeding up the projectile by 150%, adjusting the traces to match that new 150%. And then what ends up happening is that the running effect catching up projectile, it's just much less noticeable. I'll show you what it looks like. So here we are firing it like this, right? But here we are running, and you can see it still goes away from us. It doesn't look too bad. Okay, now what we're going to do is we are going to use our damage formula to calculate the damage. So I made a ton of changes to the HW gameplay effect execution calculation, and I created a new gameplay effect using that, which I showed earlier. We're going to go look at the settings and how this works. This one's actually pretty complicated. There's a lot to it, and I want to talk about a little trick that I played with crit damage. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the crit damage before we go take a look at it. So in this gameplay effect execution calculation, I need to tell the attribute set, I need to communicate to the attribute set whether it's crit damage or not, right? Because it needs to know, because as you saw, the crit damage gets a different effect on the floating combat text, right, than the other. So I need to know which it is, but the only thing I can communicate with is a number. All I have is a number, right? So I'd like to be able to maybe add a gameplay tag that said, hey, this is crit damage, or I'd like to maybe be able to send a true or false saying, hey, this is crit damage, but I can't do that. All I've got in this gameplay effect execution calculation, without making modifications to the gameplay ability system, which we could do, but sticking with these defaults here, is all I've got is this number. So I came up with 3 possible methods. The first would be to figure out what the maximum possible damage is. Let's just say it's 999,999. Okay? That's well within the range of numbers we can use, right? And so what we could do is say, okay, if it's crit damage add 999,999 to it. And then when we get the value, say, is it larger than 999,999? And then if so, subtract it, right? So we're basically splitting it into two sections. The larger numbers would be crit damage, the lower ones. And so we're basically using an encoding method to encode it by using that 999,999. So that's one possible thing we could have done. We could also, and this one's really common, I see a lot of programmers do this, when they need a separate type of a number, they switch it to negative, right? And so they would say, okay, positive numbers are regular damage, negative numbers are crit damage, right? Because numbers can go positive or negative. So that's another method we could totally use. That one I was a little bit not sure about because I didn't know if maybe in the future there might be a concept of negative damage, right? Normally you'd go negative damage, that's healing, but maybe there's another kind of thing called negative damage. I don't know. So I was a little bit worried about that one. I think the first one probably is a really good method. The second one, maybe. I ended up using the third because I thought it was interesting. And so the third one says, hey, odd values mean crit, even values mean non-crit. And you might say, well, that means the damage isn't going to be right. And you are correct. It's potentially off by one number. This would be a problem if we were doing low damage numbers. So like if the damage numbers are like 10, 20, 30, 40, some of these, one might be a significant amount to be off by in crit damage or not crit damage. But I think for the range that we're going to probably be using, which is in the hundreds and thousands and maybe even tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands for damage, I don't think that percentage is going to be enough to be an issue. So let me show you what that looks like in the code, and then we'll take a look at the blueprint setup. So here is our gameplay effect execution calc. And you can see here, I don't have H file. Anyway, there's just this one method here, execute implementation. The rest of this is just set up for the capture. We are capturing attack, defense, and max health. We are capturing those three because if you remember the way that our damage formula works, is that some abilities scale off attack, some abilities scale off defense, and some abilities scale off max health. This is very similar to how Genshin Impact works and a lot of other ARPGs. And then we need to be able to know the crit rate and the crit damage. Now, we use a split damage system. A lot of times to get around these crit issues, what people will do is they'll just handle the crit rate and the crit damage calculations on the defense side. And we could totally do that. We totally could. It's just that remember when I said that I wanted to do a split damage system, I said we're going to do the attacker related stats are going to happen in the effect execution calc, and the defender stats are going to happen in the attribute set. I didn't want to break that rule, and so that's why we ended up like we did, and we do have to look at the crit rate and the crit damage. So what we do is we come down here. This is basically our math, and we grab some things. We say, what are the tags on the source? What are the tags of the target? Maybe in the future, those will affect things here, although a lot of that ends up in the attribute set. And then what we do is we come down and we do our capture. So we capture all of them. These are snapshotted. So we are snapshotting these values, meaning that if this were to apply some kind of dot effect or something, it's not going and changing it. It's using the value at the time that this was executed. They're getting snapshotted. Maybe in the future, there will be other abilities that do not snapshot. So we will have to make some changes when that comes. We're going to clamp our numbers. So I have decided that attack, defense, and max health cannot exceed 10,000. I was previously clamping them to 1, but I cannot do that because the way that this is being handled, and I'll show you this in a minute, we have to set the ones we're not using to 0 because it's going to scale by attack, defense, and max health. I did not want to have to create 3 different gameplay effect executions or have flags to say which ones to use. And so what I did instead is that you're going to have an ability scaler on either attack, defense, or max health, but it's more powerful than that. You could actually create abilities that are a combination of 2 of them or all 3 of them, right? But the ones that you don't want to use, you have to set to 0. So I couldn't clamp this to 1. I have to clamp it to 0. Crit rate can, of course, go from 0 to 1, 0 to 100%. There's not going to be the concept of crit rate beyond 100%. Crit damage for now, I'm saying it can't go above 1,000% crit damage. Maybe we'll adjust that in the future. I don't know. That's what we're going to stick with for now. we do a random calculation off crit rate here to decide if it's a crit. That's this Boolean here. And then what we do is we take the base damage is a combination of our attack plus defense plus max health. That's these values here that came in for our scalars. And then what we're going to do is we are going to do the crit damage calculation, which of course is whatever that base damage was. And then if it was a crit, we multiply it by crit damage divided by 100. The reason we have to divide by 100 is that the crit damage is coming in as a value, that is 100 times larger than it should be. So then what we have to do, let's see here. So this is the part about the crit damage. So I'm going to read this because this is the part about the even and odd. Always round down to previous integer. This is done because our odd even checks below add 1 if needed. This could potentially lead to noticeable problems in games with low damage outputs. We'll be using large damage values, so that this shouldn't be an issue for us. So we use floor, which means round down. And then what we do here is we say, okay, if it was a crit and it's even, add 1 to make it odd. And then we say if it's not a crit and it's odd, add 1 to make it even. Okay? And then this is where we then add the output modifier where we get to send that one number. That's the number that goes into our attribute set and gets processed by our pre-game play effect execute on the defender side. So this is the final damage number from the attacker side. This will then get sent over. Let's go take a look at how that looks in Blueprint. So in Blueprints, we want to come into our gameplay effect and we want to find our Icicle damage effect. And under executions, you will see that we have our HW gameplay effect execution calc, right? That's what we were just looking at. And then there are 3 modifiers, okay? So you always have to add 3 modifiers. You have to add the attack, the defense, and the max health. And then what you need to do, this is per ability, right? This is Icicle damage. You have to set the scalar, right? So what happens here is that we're saying, okay, there's no defense. Damage is not based on defense. Damage is not based on max health, but it is 1.2, which in this case is 120%. So the way that this would be written, right, the way this would be written in your game, and we will add this description later, is it would say, does 120% of attack, right? Because what it's doing behind the scenes is saying, what's the attack value for your character? Get that from the stats. And then times it by 120%, which is a 1.2 scale. Okay, so that's what it's doing to figure it out. So let's just say that our attack is 100, right? I think it's actually 110 is our attack in this setup right now. But let's just say it's 100. We would times it by 1.2. 120 would be the damage. I believe it's actually 110 times 1.2, and I think the damage is like 132, assuming that it's not a crit. And so that is how we are calculating our damage. Now we'll be able to use this same method for nearly all of our attack damage going forward, because let's say that there's another character that has an attack and it scales off defense. So we would just set this to 0, and let's say that, it did 200% of defense, then we would just 2.0, right? And in the future, we may use curve tables if we have the concept of ability leveling, and then we'll basically have Excel spreadsheets that we pull in for those curve tables, and maybe these scalars change based on ability level. I think that's what I'm planning on doing. So maybe this Icicle ability, maybe at level 1 it's 120%, but then at level 2 it's 130%, and it goes up to whatever the max level of that ability is, and we'll level them up. And so what we'll end up doing is using a curve table. Anyway, we don't have a curve table we're picking, but if we picked a curve table, then it has multiple rows for each level, and it would automatically, this value wouldn't be fixed. It would instead look into that table. So that's probably what we'll do, unless we come up with something fancier. Potentially using, some other custom input, but I think right now I'm leaning toward using the curve table. We also had an error that we need to fix. Someone reported this in Discord as an error, and I meant to give you a shout out to thank you for mentioning the error. I looked through Discord. I could not find who reported it. I know they did. I didn't just find this error on my own. But someone did report it, and basically what was happening is that when you fired the icicle was correctly going in the right direction. No issues, everything was fine. But the sphere traces, if you turned on the debug so that you could see the red spheres, they actually would move with your character. Meaning that if your character rotated, now the sphere traces would happen and not match the icicle's path, right? And so this was really bad. What was happening is that in my multi-trace thing with the weight multi-trace for targets, I was not caching the launch location. It was still pointing to the underlying actor that fired it, meaning it was every tick, it was rechecking where the player who launched it was and adjusting everything off of that. And so basically all I had to do, we'll go take a look at it real quick, is I had to come into our multi-trace for target, and on activation, I have this concept of avatar actor transform. And so what I do is I basically say, hey, when it was activated, get the avatar actor, which in this case is our character, get the transform and save it to avatar actor transform. Which is a value over here that's saved right here, right? So it's a protected F transform. And so then I had to come down to this line that performs the trace. And over here, this was pointing to the avatar, which means that it would be re-getting its transform every time it performed a trace, which happens on tick when it reaches the tick that needs to do it. And so that was a problem. And so thank you for pointing out that error. But at this point, this has been fixed. And so now you can test this by firing off the projectile, rotate your character, and you'll notice that the projectile and the sphere traces continue in the originally intended direction. They're not modified by your character movement or your character rotation. If you have any questions related to this video, please leave your questions in the comments section. The Open World Server and Hub World MMO Discord link is in the video description if you want to discuss something in this video further. Like and subscribe to be notified of future videos and to help with the algorithm. Until next time, have a good one.